This is a production of Cornell University.
Thanks, Tom, for inviting me. I have had a lot of conversation with Tom over the last several years, actually as a practitioner, landscape architect, looking for research advice on how to set up this design experiment, this research experiment with in New York City. And so we've had, he's been incredibly valuable in that project. And reading the website for the horticulture program at Cornell, I realized that actually it's part of your mission is this kind of agenda to coordinate and communicate with various publics and to kind of spread knowledge and information. I really appreciate that kind of perspective and that approach, the agenda of the kind of combination of academic and applied, which is what I've been trying to do myself. So I run the Urban Ecology and Design Lab, which is a recent formation about 2010, where we focus on studying and reshaping human settlements through research and design with the goal of advancing urban sustainability and resilience. And I emphasize this combination of studying and shaping because that's essentially the interdisciplinary approach that I try to bring to projects is a kind of combination of ecological research to help quantify different particularly ecological systems, particularly the novel ecosystems we're creating in urban environments, but also recognizing that these systems aren't necessarily functioning in any kind of optimized way. How can we shape them as a designer? So my lab focuses on constructed ecosystems. And what do I mean by that? Constructed ecosystems are ecosystems that are engineered by human actions. They could be intentional or unintentional, and they're often promoted as valuable, but their ecosystem functions and values have not really been that well assessed or evaluated over time. There's some interesting examples like Michael van Valkenburg's General Mills project. I don't know, has anyone seen this project before? It actually was part of the corporate landscape at General Mills in the Midwest, and it was a prairie, constructed artificial prairie landscape that actually was surrounded by birch trees, which was kind of a strange twist on the idea of fire burning. Although I guess if you turn birch inside out, you can actually, it's fire resistant. But anyway, the General Mills corporate office liked it for a little while, but eventually it kind of got old and they removed it. So it wasn't working very well during the burn events when you had guys in business suits coming in for corporate meetings. It just sort of the aesthetic didn't carry over. Although in our minds, I think the aesthetic of a burned prairie is something magical. So constructed ecosystems, it's also building on the recognition that terrestrial ecosystems are largely constructed, and there's a whole wave of kind of refocusing our attention on what we mean by ecosystems today, domesticated nature, Kariva, or the idea of futuristic restoration projects, including the field of restoration ecology, which I think is grappling with the ideas of historic reference landscapes as a guide for reconstructing ecosystems versus target ecosystems. And I think this is sort of where I'm trying to build my own practice as a designer ecologist. So you have examples like Turkey Point in Florida, where a highly artificial ecosystem or highly artificial landscape that was constructed really as a cooling system for heated water from the plant ends up supporting 25% of the adult population of crocodiles in the U.S. So you've got this kind of sort of happenstance opportunities like that. Are there ways in which we can start to construct ecosystems, combining them with infrastructure, thinking about the resources that we're producing in urban environments to promote those systems? Part of this is really, part of this has to do with human perception and the way that we conceive of nature and the way that we conceive of ecosystem functions and the kind of tools and methodologies we have to either quantify or interpret those ecosystem functions. So I find that a certain amount of my time is spent negotiating with stakeholders and working on compromise and sort of win-win solutions as a way of developing ecological strategies within an urban context. So I place a lot of emphasis on implementation also. So these are a set of bioswales that we're constructing in Bridgeport, that we've constructed in Bridgeport. And in general, my approach in part is is publication, but also publication in the real world, where you're building systems that are part of the urban environment and evaluating their performance over time. So, we all know when you think about urban systems that they're compromised. and that they're young and novel systems, and that there's global environmental changes that are taking place that are impacting those systems in fundamental ways. And we also understand that there's our understanding of those systems is somewhat limited. So we understand that some parts of these systems, but not necessarily the interaction between the parts. And we're making choices on incomplete information. And we're making choices at scales that may or may not be relevant to people or to ecological function, or making those link. So ultimately, there's a kind of an issue in terms of recognizing the novelty of urban systems and the challenges or the shortcomings of research practices, and how do we bridge those together? How do we deal with that kind of dilemma in current society? There's I've heard a number of sort of interest in this area. For example, ESA has the student group is now calling, or has what they call action science or action ecology, where there's a kind of proactive stance or proactive agenda to the ecological practices. This kind of can conflict with ideas of advocacy or the role of objectivity in the sciences, and kind of how that manifests within sort of a practice-oriented science. But I sort of am trying my best to bypass or to incorporate some of those issues into my own work. So I call this area, or I'm calling this kind of ecological urban design. I'm still sort of piecing together what the right terminology might be, but essentially it's a combination of design and ecology. It's a role for a practitioner scientist who is, in my case, a landscape architect and ecologist, but obviously you can have a variety of combinations of interdisciplinary practices in order to start to investigate this area of interest. And I'm basically combining urban design, urban design with ecological engineering at some level to develop constructed ecosystems, and I really concentrate on parks and parkland networks, land development and habitat, and urban forests, stormwater hydrology. So a little bit of a jack of all trades, but part of this, my approach is through collaboration with multiple parties. Okay, so I think within these constructed ecosystems, there's if you talk to any scientist dealing with urban ecology, they're going to make the argument that we really need to experiment and to evaluate and to start to develop a vocabulary and data and information that lets us understand what we're talking about with urban ecosystems. What's the theoretical framework in which we're anticipating or analyzing urban systems? There's a lot of discussion early on about shifting from ecology in the city to ecology of the city, where there was identifying plants and animals in urban environments, and starting to think of human, social, ecological factors as constructs of urban systems. And so, that I think it's still new and developing, and urban ecological theory has not really evolved and or manifested in a way that everyone's comfortable. So it's a kind of field in flux. But I too am very much aligned with this agenda of establishing research as a goal or as a first step to understand systems that we're working on. So I published an article with Stuart Pickett in 2005 called Design Experiments, looking at new approaches to studying urban ecosystems, where you basically develop, you kind of bridge or meld analysis with implementation. So you bridge applied management with academic science, and it facilitates situating research in multiple locations in urban environments. It allows you to incorporate an education component, because you're essentially creating a public research experiment, and navigates the complex public process in government agencies, which I would say the experiment itself may or may not, but I think the combination of design and ecology allows you to move back and forth and negotiate opportunities with government agencies, et cetera. It allows you to start to incorporate research as a component of infrastructure in urban environments, which is an essential step, and gives a public identity and negotiates sort of public space values versus ecosystem services. So it takes advantage of ecologists who are already studying complex systems and are already involved in trying to interpret, multiple variables, complex analysis on species interactions, et cetera. So ecologists have already been sort of banging their head against trying to decipher and interpret ecosystem functions in non-urban systems. So here's an opportunity to take advantage of ecological methods, ecological theory, and to start thinking about what it means for urban design, urban ecosystems, et cetera. And designers, in my mind, are agents of change. And agents, I think, is an important term here because they can help ecologists in situating research experiments in an urban context and weaving research experiments into public or into decision making or into public institutions like parkland, as I'll show you. Okay, so I have sort of three focus areas of my own, and two of which I'm going to really talk about today: green infrastructure, ecological planning, and wildlife habitat. Actually, so I'll just mention on the wildlife habitat side, for kind of to give you a context, that my PhD research actually was looking at suburbanization and amphibian populations with a large-scale land development 40 miles north of New York City. So I actually basically was working as a master planner on a master planning team with EDAW, with a related company in New York, and they were developing a 1,200-acre, about a 500-hectare site 40 miles north that had a lot of amphibian populations, a lot of breeding populations on site, and they wanted to develop, and the amphibians were in the way, essentially, which is the typical story of a large land development project. And so I sold the developer on the idea that we could incorporate research on migration patterns and look at amphibian migration as a way of actually increasing the opportunity for housing. So we actually made the developer money in our first analysis, somewhere around $7 million worth of housing property, because essentially the vernal pool system that was surrounded by a loop road and was, inevitably devastated because this is a watershed, as you can see. So it was not only migration corridors, but watershed impacts, et cetera. What happened was the planning board, the environmental consultant hired by the planning board, identified this as a problematic issue and really raised it as an obstacle to kind of slow down the development. And the developer wanted to make sure he got the 24 houses that were there, and so he was looking for any option. So the idea was, well, let's do a migration study, look at where the migrating patterns are, and since amphibians are fairly predictable in terms of their migration paths, we could realign housing and have these kind of migration corridors almost like teeth in the location of the houses. And what happened was we did the migration, 65% were coming from this angle, and so the developer immediately thought of the idea of shifting housing to either side, which ended up preserving the watershed as well and maintaining migration corridors and getting 16 houses out of the 24. So he was so excited about it that he actually let me do the same research across the entire property to inform the overall master plan. And so we ended up, this was the first site that we studied and the migration patterns. We ended up setting up the same kind of research and analysis and reorganizing the development, which is shown here in this kind of gray. Getting rid of one of the major roads, moving neighborhoods around. Of course, typical of the developer, they have a pro forma with a certain number of houses that they're trying to get into a site. So as you push in one area, then it pops up in another area, which is exactly what happened here as well. So there's kind of this relationship between academic research and land development is an interesting one, because of course the developer took advantage or used the empirical data that was coming out of the analysis to his advantage to negotiate housing and to push past some of the time constraints that are typical of a permitting process. In the second stage, we actually did a larval density study looking at variation in habitat quality across ponds, and we noted that the typical habitat assessment approaches with vernal pool systems are looking at species population, species richness. That's kind of a prioritized component. But what I found was when setting up a research experiment where I put amphibian populations, where I stocked amphibian populations in each pond with 0, 8, 16, and 24 to look at whether density had more of an impact over habitat variation. I found that habitat variation explained a lot more of the survival and growth rate of the amphibians above population density, which starts to suggest, or at least opens the questions about whether current habitat assessment practices are effective or not, or whether they need to prioritize wetland habitat more than species population and density. So we ended up finding on the study also in the process the least true, because we were wrapping fences with drift, we were wrapping ponds with drift fences, which meant that you basically caught everything that moved in and out. And so we had these incidentals. One of them was the least true, which turned out to be an endangered species, which raised other issues for the developer. So it was a very funny back and forth that happened, where a lawsuit went out on the developer from the town to address this issue of species that weren't identified during the EIS report. So, and then basically from that, I developed a series of scales of importance that land developers, or that master planners currently are not necessarily incorporating into their process of design and development. The metapopulation is simply not interpreted at all, except you might argue that some of the habitat corridors developed are towards that intention. But there's really very little attention to watersheds, which are kind of a fundamental part of amphibian breeding needs. Migration corridors, the ponds in New York have 0 buffer. In New Jersey, you have a 100-foot buffer, but amphibians travel as much as 1,000 feet. So there's a discrepancy between these as well. Okay, so that this approach, the approach that I was using in my PhD was really focused on marrying science and research practices with master planning, which is a particular side of this approach, and it has more to do with conservation, I think, than kind of the proactive constructed ecosystem approach that I introduced at the beginning. But I want to return now to this idea of constructed ecosystems and look at particularly at restoration ecologists, who I see as one of several sub-disciplines that are actually grappling with what it means to reinterpret their theory and basis of practice in the 21st century. So there's part of this is that restoration ecologists are now working more and more with designers to develop park systems that are functional or have some kind of ecosystem components to them. So in this case, originally Stephen Hendel from Rutgers was working with Michael Van Valkenburg's office on the Brooklyn Bridge project, more recently Great Ecology. And there's ideas about wetland construction that are taking place there. It's highly constrained, as you can imagine. And so the benefits that you get for the cost are kind of not, you can't really do that analysis very easily for such an urbanized park. There's also a great park in Orange County in California that Hendel is working on as well. Where there's basically an effort to marry or to program parkland for ecological benefit, and then the issue becomes, well, how do you incorporate human use patterns into this ecologically structured park system? So that's one of the dilemmas, I think, within the restoration field. So it's, there's a unique heritage within restoration ecology. It's an intentional activity that initiates or accelerates the recovery of an ecosystem with respect to its health, integrity, and sustainability. It attempts to return an ecosystem to its historic trajectory based on reference ecosystems, and it relies on careful and systematic planning and monitoring approaches with established goals and performance metrics towards ecosystem recovery. And there's this opportunity for restoration and applied ecology where practitioners are trying or looking to expand their territories, essentially. And this has to do with a number of factors that we're facing today, including invasive species or coastal resilience and global warming, et cetera. So I see it as uniquely placed, but I also think it provides it starts to expose some of the issues that we face in how to marry or how to rethink our approach. Their restoration ecology builds on things like agriculture, where you're dealing with production and optimization practices. So there's a whole working component to restoration ecology that has relevance within an urban context. It also where there's incomplete knowledge, and there's the necessity to make decisions on incomplete knowledge, which I think is one of the differences between a lot of the applied ecologists and the basic science approaches. So it's expanding into these new applications, adaptation methods, efforts to quantify ecosystem services, ways of controlling invasive species, thinking about natural landscapings to substitute for lawns or habitat in public park amenities. And they're working on land types that are fundamentally urban and that have that really need to be re-evaluated and reconstructed for future promotion of ecosystem services in urban environments. They're dealing with abandoned sites, brownfields, wetlands, et cetera. But there's questions about what to prioritize and how important are people in this system. When if you're following the money, do you follow the money or do you follow the best ecological benefits in terms of prioritization? And how do you assess the long-term resilience and sustainability? And then there's this other aspect of the aesthetic form, I think, which is an important component of restoration ecology that I'll mention in a second. But and then finally, this idea of defining ecosystem function. How do you define these systems within an urbanized construct? So, historically, restoration ecologists have tended towards naturalistic design strategies. So even though I would say that most restoration ecologists probably would not say that they have a design ideology, there's a default design ideology, which is essentially naturalistic. Construct a system to make it look like nature, and also hopefully construct a system to make it function like nature. But looking like nature doesn't necessarily mean functioning like nature. So, and looking like nature also has some problems with it. For example, and this is something that Joy Zedler has mentioned, when you construct these systems that look natural and you go through the pains of kind of organizing it in organic forms, it's often can be, from a construction standpoint, more costly. Also, it's hard to compare those systems to other systems that you create. So you're actually losing an opportunity to embed research components and modularity into the system that you can evaluate over time and test and evaluate performance. So you end up spending a fair amount of money constructing a system that's essentially a one-off and that you can evaluate as a whole. The other issue, in my mind at least, is that funding opportunities, trying to get funding to construct these kinds of things, often the funder is looking for something that can be identified. And when you have a restoration site next to an adjacent natural area and they look almost the same, it becomes kind of difficult for to get money or solicit funding in an urbanized world where you want it to have some identity or meaning. So. On top of that, I think many restoration ecologists remain dedicated to their traditional practices, which is understandable because, in a way, the notion identifying a historic reference is sort of it's a way forward. It's a way to have to validate decision making. And if you don't have that approach and you're thinking only into the future or into some kind of futuristic or target ecosystems, it's more challenging to decide what you prioritize. Okay, so as restoration ecologists expand their breadth, they're rethinking reference ecosystems, and they're more and more working with stakeholder communities. So just an example of a recent project that I see as being kind of a futuristic restoration. I don't know, have people gone to the Museum of Modern Art Rising Currents exhibit? Did anyone make it down to the Rising Currents? So there was some interesting projects there. It was fairly architectural, but Kate Orff's project called Oyster Texture was this notion of taking the life cycle of the oyster and mapping it onto the harbor of New York City. And let's see here. She basically the notion was essentially to organize the early stage of the organism so that it would essentially play a role in cleaning the Kiwanis Canal, and then to move that system into a kind of wave attenuation structure that where you essentially plant these organisms along as a kind of buffer wave attenuation for New York City. So and she started to bridge those ideas with pedestrian paths, for example, where the ecological systems would be underneath the path for ease of access, and started to incorporate it into the design of the city. Okay, so part of this idea or this approach to bridge ecological strategies with design and to kind of build on the restoration ecology approach has to do with compromise. And I find again and again that I'm trying to determine where and how to compromise. And I think that this is a struggle for the science world because ultimately there's things that you can compromise and there's things that you can't, and it's a tough it's a challenge to decide what you give up. One of the things that I asked John Aber when he was visiting Yale recently was whether, he was actually talking about this notion of compromise, and so I asked, well, are there ways in which we would then compromise the science in order to incorporate it into, for example, into the time scale of a land development project? So if a land development master planning process takes 9 months to a year, or maybe a year and a half, there's only so much research that you're going to be able to do that's from a science perspective that's going to be valuable. I mean, you might get one season, you might get 2 seasons in if you're strategic, but in other words, the data results aren't going to be as useful, or from a science perspective, aren't going to be as helpful. So, and we debated or discussed that topic, and his sense was that the science is a science, and the approach is you stick by a certain methodology that's been developed, or your results are not as useful or not as valuable. And so I think this is a real struggle. I looked into this a little bit while working at EDAW. I got a client in practice grant to participate with Presidio Trust, which is on the West Coast. I don't know if folks have been to this pretty amazing post-military landscape right in San Francisco. It's It's interesting for a lot of reasons, but there's a number of stakeholders there. You've got the cultural historians who basically, it's a historic landmark, and not only are the buildings historically landmarked, but the landscape is historically landmarked. So for those of you that have been there, it was one of the largest afforestation efforts in the country from the 1880s, 1890s, where there actually trees were planted in monoculture blocks in regiments to mimic the military history, eucalyptus and a variety of other species, and they grew up into a mature canopy. So the whole ecosystem, this scrub shrub community, coastal community, is a forested environment that a lot of people think of as being the historic nature of that area. So there's very complicated stakeholder relationships to this landscape, partly historical, partly the public users who walk their dogs there and would die to see these trees removed, partly the maintenance folks, and partly the restoration folks who actually are very keen on removing the forest and trying to replace it with a biologically rich environment. So we were working with each of these stakeholders and through dialogue, negotiating or learning about what their drivers were, what their interests were. So we dealt with public groups, with nature lovers, and with historical folks. And there's this is all, by the way, a national park. So it shifted from a military base to a national park. So it's under the National Park Service. It's the most urban, or one of the most urban national parks. I guess Gateway in New York is another. But it's So you've got, not only is the local public who live adjacent, and there's actually 60 million square feet of real estate on site, so people actually rent property on the historic base, but there's people living right outside, and then there's the entire United States public who who has rights to this land as the national park. So we were working on a particular area that is becoming their sustainability center, and we were, and there was a biologically rich sort of creek bed here that had the general's house at the top right here, and military housing here. By the way, this is the only community garden on the entire property. There's a list of hundreds and hundreds of people that want to have a community garden on the Presidio, and but the historic stakeholders have fought them off for years. So that what the restoration ecologists, or the community gardeners, then went into the map library and looked through old maps and found that there had been a victory garden on this particular property, on this area, and so they got their garden, their community garden. It's like a 1 acre piece out of about 1,200 acres. So this was a pretty interesting site because it had been designed as a public garden, so it was a historical garden. It's associated with the general's house, but it also had been left alone for quite a while, and so it had grown and was the community developed restoration ecology group had a greenhouse system here and had been pretty actively restoring this creek bed system. So there's a lot of involvement here. One last point was that the same group that had worked here had worked on Inspiration Point, which is right around there. And basically, Inspiration Point is the highest point in Presidio, and it's got, or had at one point, a fantastic view of the whole bay. But the trees had grown up and blocked the entire view, so you couldn't see anything. So the Presidio Trust coordinated with the local restoration ecologists and developed a community-driven restoration project there, where the Presidio Trust came out at night and cut down the trees, removed them, and had them that right away the morning after. Everyone was out planting locally gathered seed plants from local genotypes. So it was this kind of political strategy using ecological restoration folks as a kind of means to negotiate. And of course, the view is fantastic now, and everyone's happy about it. But it's hard to get past that first wave. So we found in our analysis that essentially there wasn't one solution to this strategy. It was too small to really have your cake and eat it too. And we came up with this idea that this bridge that actually really just became a kind of an illustration of the compromises that were that one might make with a site like this. Essentially, you could have wildlife habitat and no human access, where you could view over the system, or maybe you have a bridge that crosses it, so you have controlled access and wildlife viewing, or you could have complete access and make it into a park system, so it becomes more of an integrated park. But then your ecological benefits, aside from water quality and impacts, et cetera, are highly reduced. So what we found from this was that you ended up with a bunch of questions. what's more valuable in an urban park setting? Is it public access or habitat preservation? What takes precedent in a historic national park, ecosystem function or historic preservation? Can public use and recreation be integrated with habitat enhancement and controlled visitation? And how can one ensure that opposing stakeholders reach a winning consensus rather than everyone giving up too much? Which in some ways is what we found through this process, is that no one was really willing to give up their perspective easily. Okay, so I've talked a little bit about design experiments and this strategy that I've been putting forward in terms of coupling ecological research and urban design as a means to move forward. And part of the argument is here, traditional research approaches, you set up your, ecologists are looking to study a system to understand how it works. So you set up experimentation, you analyze the system, and from your results you can get ideas as a kind of adaptive management, for example, to alter the system and as a kind of feedback. With design experiments, you're sort of taking for granted, you're assuming that the system is not necessarily working all that well, or you're working with a constructed system where you can manipulate the system and put in a kind of new functioning system that you can then analyze over time. So it's a kind of proactive approach that brings in the science and research strategy, but it brings it in the process of change. So at the same time, experimentation has an interesting aesthetic. There's spatial sort of modularity to experimentation. There's a kind of geometry driven by statistical means or statistical needs, but it actually has a relation to kind of a design aesthetic or design practices. So I'm going to talk about that in a second, but I wanted to give you an example of a design experiment that I proposed for the High Line, where basically it's a prairie ecosystem, a highly constructed prairie ecosystem on porous paving. And you basically use a fire retardant material periodically, and you'd burn a strip, and then that would become your path. And then 2 or 3 years down the line, you'd burn another strip, and then that would become your path. And then it would be a self-seeding prairie kind of landscape for education purposes, for example. At the same time, design experiments have this stakeholder outreach or stakeholder engagement component to it. It's in the public realm. It's a research-driven, but it's also implementation-based. And through this kind of implementation practice, such as a project that I worked on in Harlem on a community garden at 123rd Street, it's a way of getting people involved, and you start to, people come out of the woodwork or start to participate in land development, especially in an urbanized context. And then finally, it's really the intention is also to generate and develop urban ecology as a science, and to start to think about ways such as Larry Baker's work on household scale ecosystem dynamics, to think about scales of analysis that are appropriate or that are meaningful to decision makers, policymakers, or homeowners. Okay, so I've mentioned this idea of the aesthetics of experimentation, and so I wanted to just go through and show you a few examples of what I'm thinking about here. So there's Tillman's work. There's these kind of mesocosm ideas. Hubbard Brook. This is the Million Trees Project, which I'm going to show. There's going back to the idea of the concern that I raised about restoration ecologists and how there's a default naturalistic design intent behind the approach. For a designer going through, for example, my experience at Harvard, everyone is hypersensitive to what your design influences are. It's a hypersensitivity, and actually for landscape architects in the United States, one of the biggest challenges is how to get out of underneath the shadow of Olmsted, who has created this incredible shadow, partly because of his, some of his amazing projects and the breadth of his projects. But he brought in this whole notion of the picturesque from the English, which really evolved out of a rural agrarian landscape quality that ended up that went through painting. It made its way to landscape design, and then when it was brought to the States, my interpretation is that it kind of coagulated or sort of gelled with the wilderness ethic or the wilderness concept. And people have talked about the idea that Yellowstone was probably selected because it had been cleared periodically through burning practices and reminded people of the idyllic nature. So as a landscape architect, this is actually a pretty big challenge. Do I design naturalistically or not? It's a sort of branch in the field, and a lot of landscape architects struggle with redefining an aesthetic while often being pegged as or being requested to do naturalistic design, because not only is it a dilemma in the field of landscape architecture, it's a perception or an idea held by Americans at large, because Olmsted's park systems and others afterwards essentially introduced the picturesque across the country. So everyone, when you think about a park, or most people when you think about a park, you think of a picturesque style or naturalistic park. It's very different in Europe, where there's a lot of geometry as a component. So design experiments bypass that ideological layer and get ecologists and designers negotiating and working around statistical drivers and geometry and modularity as a medium through which you can come up with design aesthetic. This is Robert Smithson's project, where he called a non-site, where he would take material from sites, organize it in some sort of a frame, and then bring it off-site and have these kind of like the 6 materials of his site would all be in these kind of containers. He was very interested in what material meant when it was removed from an area or a given kind of structure. You know, there's Alan Sanborn's topographic projections, where there's a kind of effort to create modularity around an organic form, you know, and to start to frame that. There's also a whole investigation into dynamic systems and dynamic patterns and how to represent those, or how to represent multifaceted perspectives. So this idea of dynamic ecosystems has relevance in the art world. It's a question partly of determining how to bridge the dialogue. You know, there's so from that I've kind of pushed for this idea of a collage aesthetic, which basically takes maybe some of Gleason's mapping of prairie ecosystems in the UW Arboretum, in that dynamic nature, and builds on the data-rich capacity of designers today, or the ability to kind of crunch a lot of information with various programs to think about it, a design aesthetic. I've always been interested in Rem Koolhaas's project for Downsview Park as a site for researching island biogeography and habitat corridors. It wasn't really part of the study at all, but it's you know, he had this notion that he would create circles of ecosystems, or circles of landscape that would be programmed. And you know, it would be great to set up some kind of a large-scale study on animal migration patterns or animal movement patterns across these patches. And then there's precedent for combining science and design, going back, you know, going way back. But I think Mel Chen's revival field with USDA chemists in one of the earliest reclamation projects in the country, funded by art money for a kind of science project, I think is a really interesting example of this bridging. Okay, so I want to just now take you into, or discuss the Million Trees project, which I worked on first at EDAW, which actually EDAW merged with AECOM Design, so it became a giant conglomerate while I was there. Basically, we won the project in 2008 with. It was through EDAW and Donna Walcavage in New York. Donna had a on-call contract with the Parks Department. There are 8 landscape architecture firms that have on-call contracts with the New York City Parks Department, and so any project that comes out, they bid on it, and whoever is deemed the best bidder wins the project. When this project came along, it was a very unusual project for those 8 practitioners, because it really had a underlying research and science questions, and the kinds of issues that the Cornell Horticulture is probably maybe one of the most adept, or the kind of depth that you show here. But in the practitioner world, you know, you don't have that kind of knowledge base thinking about how to construct an urban forest, you know, and so Donna called EDAW, and we decided to partner, and then we created a series of outreach efforts, including my telephone calls to Tom Whitlow, to try to infuse this process with research ideas and research education. So, you know, I remember sitting at a community meeting, and one of the community members asking, you know, why a million trees? Why not trees and shrubs, and, you know, why not a variety? And the chief naturalist said, well, you know, when the mayor tells you to plant 1 million trees, you plant 1 million trees. And and it's kind of, you know, so this project is as much political as it is ecologically driven. I would say maybe more political than ecologically driven. But we were really interested in the questions about how do you construct an urban forest? You know, what are the criteria that you need to take into consideration? And we were also really interested in the role of analysis and research that one might be able to do with enough coordination up front on seed, seed source, the influence of politics and budget on performance, the issue of parks maintenance practices and how that influences design, the whole question that New York City has been asking about community boards and kind of discrepancies in terms of community board canopy cover, and then local questions about public parks and urban forests, about things like species richness and the value of species richness, or how to deal with invasive species, et cetera. So there were lots of questions to ask. So the project was actually rather large. It was it was a combination of citywide, how to plant a million trees across the city, and in this case we were the project was split between the New York Restoration Project, who's doing implementation on private land and street trees, and the Parks Department doing work with us on public parkland. So we were really looking only at public parkland, not at street trees, which is a fundamentally different set of drivers. But we looked at dominant vegetation and pH and moisture levels as a way of categorizing land types. And we had decided early on that we would identify areas with a lot of invasive species, then we would replace those with forest. Because one of our dilemmas was, if we're planting dense forests 4 feet on center across the city, what's that going to do to the state of public access and parkland? And so we thought it would be politically strong to propose replacing invasives, and there are a lot of invasives in New York. So, we developed a series of invasive management strategies for the project that were all pretty intensive, and these were a kind of combination of research ideas coupled with the Parks Department Natural Resources Group, which is a sub group within the Parks Department. It's a very unusual and sophisticated group of practitioners that have been doing this kind of work, at least at a smaller scale, for about 2 decades. And then we came up with a series of species palettes depending on the alkalinity, the hydrology of the soils. And we had this process of site analysis or site entitation, which is really a parks management practice, a fairly rapid assessment of what's on the ground. Oops, sorry. So the way that we made this work, because we started talking about research as a component of the design from early on, from our response in the RFP and the first several meetings, but meeting after meeting, we would bring up this idea of research as a component, of the process, and there was conversations like, we don't necessarily know what the benefits of soil amendments are going to be, whether it's going to be more beneficial for the plants that we planted over time, or whether it's going to actually increase invasive species recruitment patterns, and we're not quite sure what's better, or questions about species richness, whether or not it's going to be whether or not we'll have more survival if we plant a higher diversity of species or less, So there were certain things that we were uncertain about, and the Parks Department was concerned about those issues, but they were in this role where they had incomplete information and had to make choices. So we decided to frame the research questions around the parks management assumptions, where there's debated topics in the literature, but the Parks Department has to take action. And so we essentially developed a series of research questions. It builds on the flow of knowledge with the biodiversity and ecosystem functioning literature. So if this here is a representative of the BEF literature, and basically that information has made its way into the public realm through a variety of means, but let's say here ecosystem services as a concept. So ecosystem services comes forward and it embodies the information and debated topics within BEF literature, where there are a lot of debates about the value of species richness, et cetera. This information then makes its way right to the policymakers. So there's an idea that that by increasing canopy in an urban environment, that you're going to increase ecological value. And part of this influenced the urban forest sciences, where the U4 model, for example, and other models are used to and take information in, but they look at for example, the U4 model doesn't incorporate species interactions, which may be one of the fundamental aspect of how this forest is going to perform over time. So there's a number of assumptions that make their way into the U4 model, but nonetheless that influences decision making about how many trees to plant and about what the benefits of these trees are going to provide from a green infrastructure standpoint and a canopy standpoint for the urban environment. So policymakers then direct the Parks Department to plant 1 million trees. The Parks Department, particularly the Natural Resources Group, which I mentioned, have experience planting trees over the last 20 years, and so they are able to take that on as an initiative and move forward with it as an agenda. But what's missing is, or what's happening is that a lot of the assumptions here are getting embedded in the process. And so what we were trying to do at the EDAW and now the UED lab is to link this together again by developing the 1 Million Trees project as a research project, as a long-term research project. Okay, so these are 2 sites. So we not only did we do citywide implementation, but we also identified pilot sites where we could develop large-scale research as a component. We were worried about the slow pace of the citywide implementation and the variability across sites in the city, and we wanted to have a couple of discrete sites where we had a lot of replication for research. This is the old Queens Fair. There's Willow Lake here. Tom is doing work on Willow Lake now in this area he mentioned earlier. And here it is there, the MTA yard adjacent. This is actually a pretty interesting hydrologically modified urban condition where I was talking to the Parks Department about the notion, we were talking about the notion of using this as a coastal adaptation management site, because there's tide gates and it floods. And it turns out there's at least this is what I've heard, that there's a putt-putt owner just below that is the obstacle to negotiating, trying to reconstruct or to use this as a coastal adaptation, just to show you some of the local politics that can get in the way. But I'm going to talk today more about Casino, which is located here. The World's Fair is right there, so it's actually a pretty interesting linear ecosystem. And actually, Queens Botanical Garden is adjacent. Okay, so this is the site, and basically, it's actually one of the largest community gardens in the, or the largest, I think, in New York City. And there's a hospital here, Queens Botanical Garden, East-West International School. And what we've done is we've embedded a series of research plots throughout the parkland. Part of our agenda was part of our goal was how do you design parkland that can accommodate research as a component of the design and be part of and be something that is bought into or accepted within the public context. And so basically the strategy was where the research plots were surrounding it, we designed what I called cluster planting, which was essentially intended to demodulate the grid of the trees. And then outside of that, I actually developed what I call the picturesque style, which goes back to the earlier discussions that I was having about whether or not, my own debate, am I a naturalistic designer or not? Well, ultimately, the picturesque served as a kind of Trojan horse for the research plots. So the interpretation was, oh, okay, this is a picturesque style. It's a typical urban parkland design. So there weren't really many issues with it. It was only about 2 weeks before we actually planted the trees. Staging was completed. We were on site. Trees were there. The parks manager and I turned to each other and she said, "No, what do we mean by the picturesque exactly?" And then we actually sat down and talked about 15 feet on center, or 25 feet, some sort of a range. And we also planted alley trees along pathways and desire lines and along recreational areas like ball fields to essentially stitch, to create a kind of more mature landscape that the research plantings, which were small at the time, could grow into. So part of this was intentional as a design, part of it was designed as a research project. And we manipulated, so we had soil amendment, no soil amendment, we had high diversity, low diversity, and then we also planted an understory vegetation versus no understory. So we have a 7 by 8 factorial with 56 plots. And we went through and did a series of sampling and vegetation biomass studies, et cetera, to develop a better baseline data. And now we're in the process of looking at the second stage. So one of the things that we've been learning from this design experiment, which follows a model that I'm calling build it and they will come, which is used in a variety of means, but essentially if you build a good research project in an urban context with a lot of replication, then the idea is, will it attract other scientists to come and do their own research on this site? There's the example of the adaptive experimentation from ASU, where the scientists there identified these circles that were part of a domestic housing, a military housing project that were all similar sized and shaped, and they had the same number of houses around them. So it's an example of a kind of identifying a research artifact in an urban context that you can, has enough replication that you can set up an experiment on it. So this is a different approach where you you kind of virally embed yourself in the design process, and you construct these research projects for the purpose of analysis and giving people opportunities. The downside to this is that you get the funding for the experimental design and the experimental construction were all essentially paid for through public funding. And by the way, the contractor, who was fantastic, it was a great way to build an experiment, to have a contractor and his entire crew go out and sort of establish this whole thing. But it's the second half of the design experiment that's still sort of a struggle, because what you have is this constructed experiment, but the funding is not there for the monitoring component. So then you're going out and trying to essentially sell the project to different agencies to fund the second half of this experimental setup, or this experimental research. So we're in that phase now, looking at questions like, are constructed native communities and urban landscapes sustainable? In questioning whether they're resilient in the face of a variety of urban stressors. We've identified that drought is an issue that's already taken place on our site. Vandalism is pretty common. Students that are in the schools adjacent like to break the trees and use them for sword fighting. There's some really interesting dynamics. For example, we spent 2 years eradicating or trying to eradicate mugwort, and it turns out that the Asian population living in this area like to spread mugwort because it's used for tea and for I think for sushi or other kinds of foods. And so it's actually this kind of back and forth between that's going on in urban ecology. So the project itself included a wide range of stakeholders, and part of this is the role of the design experiment is bringing the agenda of stakeholder A in alignment, or as a way of furthering the goals of stakeholder B, for example. So, the Parks Department was really looking for green infrastructure and biodiversity and habitat, and they had a capital investment component that was going into it. Meanwhile, the scientists were looking for ways of testing management assumptions and establishing manipulative experiments to study these systems. And the Parks and Recreation Natural Resources Group are really looking for evidence-based management, and so they're looking for kind of quick analysis and invasive species control practices. So, and finally, the people like the Queen's Botanical Garden, who are somewhat involved, as well as the Nathaniel Hawthorne Middle School, are looking for research and education opportunities, ways of getting students involved in the process to understand their environments. I talked about this already a little bit, the idea of the research plot adjacent to the cluster, and the cluster adjacent to the picturesque, and the picturesque adjacent to the LA. These are just sort of the design drawings that were used to negotiate the process. And then this is an example of the plot itself and the way we set it up. And then the research plot itself was originally a grid, and even though the Parks Department have planted several 100,000 trees in a 4-foot on center grid, when we sent them the grid, they were troubled by kind of the way it looked, and so they wanted us to kind of or they gave some pushback to rethink how we were organizing the species and what our intentions were, and so we thought more about it, and the Parks Department, they like to plant in patches, and we started taking on that idea, and then we came up with what's actually called the Naturalistic Plot, which was essentially an organization of trees in patches or quadrats of similar species, and into these kind of clumps, and then we reorganized the shrubs and herbaceous on a different alignment to sort of break down the grid. And what we actually realized was it became a better experimental setup, because we were able to ask questions at the micro plot scale, where we're now sampling in each one of these quadrats and assessing the function or the changes in soil microbial communities, as well as tree species performance of these local clumped groups, and able to compare clump A to clump B. So it turned out to be one of these examples of a win-win situation, which is sometimes hard to achieve. These are the plots here. This is I'm working with Mark Bradford, who is a soil ecologist at Yale also, and so he's really been active in analysis of microbial community. And we're also working with Rich Hallett from the U.S. Forest Service on chlorophyll and fluorescence to look at as a method of assessing tree performance and tree health over time. And we've actually found some preliminary information, at least in this box plot, indicating that there are differences between species on site. And then we have this this kind of I wouldn't call it yet a collaboration, but these outreach programs with local school children who are coming out, and we're trying to work with the Parks Department and the school to come up with research that is doable on a short term and meaningful to students. So we're looking at things like cover boards as a way of setting up a sampling practice for local school communities to do their analysis. So I think of this as a kind of applied urban ecology that has a research aesthetic, and it's designing an experimental landscape. And so, to me, I think it's starting to bridge these fields of design and science as an approach. And part of it, as I mentioned before, is the role of implementation and actually building these things so that you can start to document all the pitfalls and the challenges of implementation over time, which is what we've been doing. One of my students recently did a life cycle assessment of the project because essentially the contractor kept notes on a weekly basis, which stacked about this high of everything that they did from the start. And so he looked at the different stages of the process and how that impact ecological function from a life cycle assessment, and found that the tree plantation process was really the biggest consumer of energy. But invasive management, although you can't really see that number for some reason, it was also pretty high. It's a black one. And so we were his analysis suggested that that basically it's going to take somewhere between 11 to 41 years to pay back all the energy input that went into implementing the Million Trees project, at least on Casina, if that's a case study. So this is one of the arguments I think being made about urban parkland afforestation practices. But some of the things that this doesn't take into account are species interactions, which is a kind of important one, and a whole range of social human factors. That the value of having a canopy or an urban forest in the city. I've been interested, Tom and I have talked about this before, of looking at, because of the Asian longhorn beetle and some of the other constraints on our plant palette options were limited, and so we planted a lot of oaks, and oaks give off volatile organic compounds. Planting them adjacent to roadways, you could get some mixing of exhaust with these the VOCs, and so there's basic questions about what it is that we're doing and what the implications of what we're doing are going to have over time in terms of ecosystem services or ecosystem benefits that really need to be evaluated. But as Tom can attest, it's a kind of a difficult effort to try to understand the turbulent dynamics of that environment. With okay, so I wanted to briefly. How am I doing on time? Over? Then let me end there. Okay.
So, well, join me in thanking Alex. And,
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.